Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Welcome back to the Truth in My Days Apologetics Program. Today, we have Dr. Adrian Torres speaking with John Torres. Today, John is looking at when the Gospel books were published. We are continuing from the last episode. We hope you enjoy.
So where are we now?
Well, we have now the Gospel according to Luke before the year 54, the Gospel according to Mark probably before AD 45, and Matthew before that, somewhere between 35 and 44.
Anything more?
There is a second line of evidence pointing to these dates and allowing us to be even more precise. They're what's called the family 35 colophons.
That's a mouthful. Family 35 colophons. What are those?
Colophons is a fancy word scholars use for inscriptions. When manuscripts were written by hand, as the Bible was for hundreds of years until the printing press was invented, until that time, the Bible was copied on handwritten manuscripts. And in many cases, the scribe, when he finished copying a book, would put a little inscription at the end, which would give information, which might include who copied the manuscript and when it was copied, or some information about the writing. So that's what a colophon is. It's one of these inscriptions added at the end of a book by the scribe who copied the book. Family 35 refers to a group of New Testament manuscripts. Scholars tend to classify the manuscripts into different groups that they call families. And family 35 is a group of several hundred New Testament manuscripts that were copied very, very carefully. Now, they're relatively late. They date from the 13th to the 15th century. About half of these have colophons at the end of the gospel books. The scribe copying it down when he finished a book put information at the end of it. At the end of the Gospel according to Mark, he put a note saying that this was published or given out 8 years after the ascension. At the end of the Gospel according to Mark, he put a note saying it was published 10 years after the ascension, that is the ascension of Jesus up into heaven after he'd been with the disciples for 40 days. At the end of the Gospel according to Luke, he put out a note saying that the Gospel according to Luke was published 15 years after the ascension of Jesus. And at the end of the Gospel according to John, he put out a note saying that the Gospel according to John was published 32 years after the ascension of Jesus. So this actually gives us very precise dates for these books. That would put Matthew at the year 41 or 42. Mark to 43 or 44, Luke to 48 or 49, and John to the year 64 or 65, which are very precise, and they fit exactly into what we've seen already.
When the scribes copy these manuscripts, do they also copy the original colophon that's on the manuscript that they're copying from?
Well, that would be the question. Since these manuscripts are relatively late, as I said, can we actually trust the colophons? And I think we can for two reasons. First, as Dr. Wilbur Pickering, who's an expert in this field, and possibly the top expert when it comes to these, he points out that the colophons were actually very widespread among manuscripts from many different sources. And to have these colophons, and about 50% of them, says that the tradition that was being copied here must have been very ancient. Now, do note that the gospel texts in the manuscripts themselves are much older than the manuscripts. One of these manuscripts might come from the 13th century, but the books in it come from the 1st century, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So there's no reason the colophons themselves cannot be also equally old or very old. But if that's all we had, yes, it would be questionable. But there's another reason.
What is the other reason?
The other reason is the third line of evidence that converges on these dates. And that is commentary from Eusebius, that church father who was the greatest church historian, wrote Historia Ecclesiastica, History of the Church, and a book called Chronicon or Chronicle in the early 4th century, and he had access to the very earliest material at the time. Now, in his book Chronicon, Eusebius places the writing of Matthew into the 3rd year of Caligula, the Roman emperor. Now, the 3rd year of Caligula matches what you find in the family 35 colophon exactly. The 3rd year of Caligula is the 8th year after the Ascension. But since they're worded differently, Eusebius is writing in terms of the year of the Roman emperor. The colophons are talking about the year after Ascension. It suggests that they're drawing on different sources of information when they give the dates. So that's the two lines of evidence there converge exactly. And then in his book, Historia Ecclesiastica, Eusebius tells us that Mark wrote after Peter left Rome, which we've seen already in other sources of information. The question is, when did Peter leave Rome? And in Chronicon, Eusebius tells us that that happened in the 3rd year of Claudius, the next emperor. And the 3rd year of Claudius would be the 10th year after the Ascension. So again, the information we get from Eusebius, which is early, not late, matches exactly what we see in the colophons, which come later. And I find that extremely significant. We have two different sources here, drawing from two different original fonts of information, and yet converging on the exact same dates. To me, that means there's no good reason not to accept it. It seems to me that those who then want to argue for different dates have the burden of proof on them. Now, Eusebius doesn't tell us about what year Luke was published in or John, but since he's so accurate, they match so exactly on Matthew and Mark, I think we should accept then what colophons say about the date of Luke and the date of John. So in conclusion then to this part, we see that internal and external evidence sets clear limits on the possible dates of these books, and they agree with the specifics that we see in those colophons and in Eusebius. So I think we should conclude that the Gospel according to Matthew was published in the year 41 or 42, Mark in the year 43 or 44, and Luke in the year 48 or 49. We'll look at the Gospel according to John in another program.
Well, I think the evidence from the colophons and from Eusebius are really amazing in accuracy. If you think about it, they come from different sources. I think should be very convincing to people when these gospel books were originally written.
It should be. I agree with you. And the sad thing is, it's almost never mentioned. You find those standard textbooks that I mentioned, they never refer to these. And I'm not sure why. Of all the sources I've looked at, all the different scholarly books, I only ever found one that actually referred to the information from Eusebius, and that was John Wenham's book, Redating Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, and this is why I say that for the kind of elite level apologetics that is needed at this time when Christianity is under such assault, we need to really do our homework and get the best information. The result of what we've looked at then is that our knowledge of Jesus, of who he was, what he did, his miracles, his ministry, his teachings, his death on the cross, his resurrection from the dead, we know to be based on eyewitness testimony written by people who knew him, or in the case of Luke, who got information from eyewitnesses directly, people in a position to know, publishing very early, 8, 10, 15 years after the ascension of Jesus, 32 in the case of John. The claim of the liberal scholars that they're anonymous, these books, and published long after the fact, claims that were never based on evidence, are clearly wrong. Now, what's more, what we typically hear from evangelical scholars and apologists is also wrong. I recall this claim that we mentioned earlier from a functionary from a popular creation science ministry. She said, the accounts in the Gospels are neither the only nor the earliest evidence we have of Christian writing about the resurrection. That honor goes to 1 Thessalonians, one of the earliest of Paul's letters, which was written around AD 50. Now, I pointed out that this is actually a very problematic claim because it would mean that we're dependent not on eyewitnesses for the earliest evidence, but on people who were not eyewitnesses being informed by somebody else who was not an eyewitness. And it turns out then that this claim is wrong. The accounts in the gospel books are the earliest that we have about the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all published before 1 Thessalonians, before any of Paul's letters. The functionary went on to say this: so we have evidence that about 2 decades after Christ's death, there was a group of people who insisted he was raised from the dead and had built a decent portion of their theology around that fact, which doesn't happen overnight. Now, I pointed out that that meant that the earliest evidence we had for the resurrection of Jesus is that a group of people who are not eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus, living in a city in the Hellenic world far from Israel, about 2 decades after Christ's death, believed that Jesus was raised from the dead because they had been told that by another man who was himself not an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. And we pointed out that that is very, very weak stuff. But now we see the reality is that we are not dependent on the insistence of a group of people who are not eyewitnesses, who heard from another guy who was not an eyewitness. We have personal testimony from the Apostle Matthew, who spent 3 years or so with Jesus during his ministry and who saw him after he had risen for 40 days, during which he showed himself alive by many infallible proofs. And he recorded this for us a mere 8 years after the fact. Same thing in the case of Peter, the apostle, who had his testimony recorded by Mark 10 years, published 10 years after the fact, and Luke, who got his information straight from eyewitnesses and recorded it, published it 15 years after the fact. It also debunks the claim that the gospel accounts were penned decades after the events they describe, from AD 55 to 85. No, they were penned from AD 41 to 64, which is not decades, except in the case of John. And they do not go back to early tradition. They are direct eyewitness testimony, standing solid as a rock and foundation for our faith.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting and very edifying, because it's very important for us to know where these claims come from. Where were the claims of Jesus rising from the dead, which is in itself quite unbelievable. And if you don't have eyewitness accounts, that would make that claim very weak indeed. So I think this session is finished, and I hope that we will come back again and listen to another topic next week.
Indeed we will. Thank you for being with us.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.